The Texas House last night joined the Senate in passing a voter ID measure.
The bills have passed mainly along party lines in the voting so far, and Fox 4's James Rose has our story.
In 2008, a precinct in my very own district received a voter turnout of more than 100%. That's a problem, and it was probably because of voter fraud. What this legislation does is help ensure that that doesn't happen again.
Republican Representative Stephanie Carter from Dallas voted for the photo ID measure. Versions passed in both the House and Senate still have to be reconciled before going to the governor. But Republicans say the legislation would instill confidence and integrity to the system.
It is going to suppress the vote. Texas is already the worst state in the union for voter turnout, and this is going to make it worse.
The chairman of the Dallas Democratic Party says the elderly, poor, and minorities will be disenfranchised.
If they wanted to protect the integrity of voting, they would make voting easier. They're making it harder because all they want to do is to restrict the people who vote. And I think voting is a sacred right of citizenship that should be as available to every citizen in as easy a manner as possible.
Voters would be required to present a valid form of state or federally issued photo identification before casting a ballot.
If you're going to present a photo ID when you register, why does it not make sense to also present a photo ID when you vote?
Republican political lawyer Chris Gober says the measure is just a logical step to ensure free and fair elections.
And really in this debate, you have to make sure and not lose sight of, well, for every fraudulent voter that's out there, you're also disenfranchising the votes of legal voters.
Both sides admit mail-in ballots cause the most voter fraud problems, and the bills don't address that. Republicans say that will be addressed with more legislation. James Rose, Fox 4 News.
Make sure our elections are fair, that the voters have confidence their system has integrity, and their vote counts.
All right, this bill is a big enough priority to Governor Perry that he gave it emergency status earlier this year so it could move more quickly through the legislature. So let's debate this voter ID, just as they've been debating down in Austin. We're joined tonight by Dallas County Democratic Chair Darlene Ewing and attorney Chris Gober, who has worked with several Republican candidates along the way. Ms. Ewing, I want to pose the first question to you, and I know you've heard this before, but you have to have an ID to buy a beer, to drive, to get a job, to get a library book for that matter. How is requiring an ID to vote, which the state will actually give you for free, so encumbering, so tough, and so discriminating?
Well, first of all, it's really not free, number one, because you get a free ID, but you have to have a certified birth certificate, something of that nature, and so as a consequence, it's really not free. Secondly, we talk about, oh, well, if you have to do this, fly, do whatever. Voting is a constitutional right. It is not a privilege. It's a constitutional right. So this is a constitutional right of citizenship that should be protected. And so it's not that simple. And next, I'd like to say is it's not, if it was any photo ID and all we were trying to do is protect, and people from impersonating voters, of which there's no history of anybody doing that. But if that's what they really wanted to, then why can't you use any photo ID? You said in your opening, any government ID. That's really not true. That's not what the bill provides.
Mr. Gober?
Well, I think what we're ignoring here is the fact that when any voter wants to register to vote for the first time, that they have to show a form of identification in the first place. So really this voter ID law that the Texas legislature passed is really just a logical step, one step further than what we already have in place here in the state of Texas and every other state, because that's a federally mandated provision.
It's interesting in my looking around, and I've been kind of frustrated by this over the past several months, because on both sides there's really no proof at all that there's a cause and effect on either side. Ms. Ewing, there is no evidence. You tell me, what's your evidence that voters will become disenfranchised by this kind of law?
You have to look at the statistics. 11% of the general population don't have the photo ID. That's one of the 5 or 6 that are allowed by this law. It's the most restrictive law in the state. The studies that have been done by Rutgers, Ohio State University show that voting was reduced by anywhere from 5% to as much as 10%.
Can I read you a quote? Can I read you a quote? A study published in Election Law, the researchers actually said, leading up to their conclusion, they said it should be evident that our sympathies lie with the plaintiffs. That means your side, Mrs. Ewing. And they say, yet we see the existing science regarding vote suppression as incomplete and inconclusive. That means no proof for your argument. They were looking for it. They admitted they wanted it, and they didn't find it. Mr. Gober, let's talk about your side. Now, your side talks a lot about voter fraud. But for all the talk, there sure hasn't been many cases go to court. 8 voter fraud cases in the last 8 years. How is this even necessary?
Well, the particular voter fraud that we're talking about here, which is in-person voter fraud, is almost impossible to detect. I mean, the fact is...
So we're going on gut instinct that, boy, this must be happening, so let's make a law.
I would point Ms. Ewing and other opponents of the bill to this, and that is a bipartisan task force on federal election reform. That task force was co-chaired by none other than President Jimmy Carter. And in that report they said that voter fraud is real and that photo ID requirements are a necessary measure to protect the integrity of the process.
Ms. Ewing, what do you
Well, first of all, you know, the studies that I've seen, the 5-year study by the federal government shows that this type of voter suppression bill does suppress the vote. Second of all,
I don't know that it's a voter suppression bill. I think that's you.
Well, that's my term for it. You want to call it voter ID. I call it a voter suppression bill. It's all about spin and it's not about voting ID. If it was only about voting ID, then if I was an FBI agent, I could use my federal ID. This bill wouldn't allow that. If I worked for the Department of Justice, who's going to have to oversee that, I wouldn't be allowed to use my voter ID.
Let's get into that. Isn't this a political winner for both sides? Ms. Ewing, isn't this a win for Democrats who they can say words like disenfranchised, which sometimes is a code word for racism, and they can throw that on Republicans. Republicans, you can play to the huge anti-illegal immigration crowd. I mean, this falls really in the sweet spot for both your sides, doesn't it?
I don't think so, because, you know, what it's trying to do is it's disenfranchising the kind of voters that we have probably more of than Republicans. This is an attempt by the elitists to say, oh, well, we only want voting by the best, the smartest, the brightest, the richest, the poor. The poor are more likely not to have a driver's license. The poor are more likely not to have the 4 requirements, the passport. How many people working at McDonald's do you know go to Europe every summer with their passport? These are the kind of people that are going to be disenfranchised.
Well, I would take the position that this is not either a Republican or a Democrat issue, but an issue for every voter out there that wants their vote to matter. And the bottom line is, in 2010, Rasmussen conducted a nonpartisan poll and found that 82% of likely voters believe that all voters should show some form of photo ID when they show up and to vote. And what was interesting about that poll is actually every demographic in that poll, a majority of likely voters agreed that that they should show a photo ID at the polls. So breaking this down on a Democrat issue, Republican issue, you can't argue with the fact that 82% support legislation like this.
All right, let's talk about it at the state level. Now, teachers are going to lose their jobs because of budget cuts and all this stuff. What's the cost of providing free IDs? I think, Ms. Ewing, I might go at it that way if I was a Democrat. What's the cost?
We have. Representative Anchia made that point on the floor of the House. Right now, a state photo ID costs $16, but it's free if you go in and say you need it to vote. That he's estimating that it'll be lost about $14 million over the next 2 years, because people aren't stupid. They'll go in and say, I need a state photo ID so that I can vote, and plus this money is put into the Texas Mobility Fund, which is a trust fund they use to pledge for us to get bonds to sell for transportation.
I got to wrap this up. Mr. Gober,
okay.
You want to respond on the cost thing?
Look, with any piece of legislation, I hope that our legislators are good stewards with our money and decide to pass legislation that is in the best interest of our state, and I believe that this is one of those pieces.
All right, Ms. Ewing, Mr. Gober, thanks. Still up to, we'll see how this compares to other laws in states that have gone through the federal government and had no problem, or you know, with the DOJ, and we'll see if Texas flies too. Thank you on this.
Right. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.